The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast, where we dive into the world of extremist thinking and cult dynamics to understand our world better. I'm your host, Chris Shelton. Thank you very much for joining me this week. Today, we're exploring the evolution of Christian nationalism in America, a movement that over the last 100 years has increasingly blended political power with a dogmatic religious identity. We'll see how a mix of cultural upheaval, political opportunism, and a cult-like sense of mission has driven segments of the population to believe that America is a divinely ordained Christian nation, and that only true believers should lead it. Before we begin, let me be perfectly clear that today's podcast is not an attack against Christian belief, or whether or not the Bible is the inerrant word of God, or whether biblical literalism is a good or a bad thing. This podcast is not my effort to passively aggressively attack religious beliefs. Instead, regardless of belief, good people can be led down a path of very bad actions. History proves to us over and over again that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And another old saying that applies very much today is that no snowflake believes it is responsible for the avalanche. Today, we're going to cover a lot of the reasons why so many Christians in the U.S. feel that they are under attack and are acting so unreasonable and extreme. If anything, this podcast is an effort to expose how key figures over the last century have been playing with social and political forces they don't fully understand, creating a kind of cultic Frankenstein's monster of extremism that could very accurately be described as the American Taliban. But this does not describe or encompass every single person who calls themselves a Christian. This is obvious to anyone who is not in the evangelical cult I'm going to talk about today. So if you find yourself listening to what I say here and feel I'm attacking you personally, I would invite you to listen a little harder and understand a little better the situation you're actually in. There are far too many Americans who have been being lied to for their entire lives. Just being able to accept that and considering changing one's mind is very hard to do. So if you're listening to this podcast at all, I want to give you a big thumbs up for having the courage to challenge some of those lies. But don't for a second think that I'm trying to insult you over your beliefs. That's not what this podcast or any of my work is about. So, let's begin our journey in the early 20th century. The 1920s were a period of profound transformation in America, a time when rapid urbanization and scientific breakthroughs were challenging long-held traditions. In the wake of World War I, many Americans found themselves caught between the comforts of tradition and the relentless push of modernity. This tension fueled the rise of Christian fundamentalism, which increasingly positioned itself as a bulwark against the encroachment of modern ideas. Notably, there was a significant backlash against alternative forms of spiritual belief that had gained popularity in the 19th century. Movements like spiritualism, which embraced mediums, seances, and the belief in communicating with the dead, offered an alternative path to understanding the divine. For many conservative Christians, however, these practices were seen as heretical, an affront to the exclusive truth of biblical revelation. This rejection wasn't just about denouncing a rival belief system, it was also a defensive response to the rapid expansion of ideas that challenged the monopoly of Orthodox Christianity. The threat wasn't only external. The intellectual legacy of the Enlightenment, which celebrated science, logic, and reason, had deeply influenced modern thought. To many devout Christians of the era, these Enlightenment ideals were perceived as undermining the very foundations of faith. Science and reason, with their insistence on empirical evidence and rational inquiry, were seen as direct challenges to the miraculous and the divine. This intellectual shift contributed to an environment where the written word and literal interpretation of the Bible became the final arbiters of truth. This simmering conflict between old and new, between faith and reason, came to a head during events like the 1925 Scopes monkey trial. The trial was not merely about the teaching of evolution, it was a symbolic showdown between modern science and traditional religious beliefs. For many fundamentalists, the trial confirmed their fears that the forces of modernity were eroding the moral and spiritual fabric of society. The language used in public discourse during this time often mirrored that of cult like rhetoric, an all or nothing battle where modern ideas were cast as the enemy of a divinely ordained social order. In this charged atmosphere, both the embrace of alternative spiritual practices like 19th century spiritualism and the challenges posed by Enlightenment rationality were seen as existential threats, forcing many believers to double down on a rigid, exclusionary version of Christianity as a safeguard against the perceived moral decay of modern society. Now, World War II happened, so we jump ahead to the 1950s, and the geopolitical landscape was defined by the Cold War. The United States was locked in a battle against an officially atheistic Soviet Union, and religion became a potent symbol of freedom and moral superiority. It was during this time that political leaders began to more explicitly fuse American patriotism with Judeo Christian values. In 1954, the Pledge of Allegiance was amended to include the phrase, "under God." This small addition carried enormous symbolic weight. It wasn't merely about patriotism, it was a deliberate signal that the nation's destiny was intertwined with divine favor. For many Americans, the inclusion of "under God" wasn't optional, it was a clear demarcation between the righteous and the godless. This era saw the seeds of the government actively instilling an us versus them mentality into its citizenry based around religious belief, where the state was portrayed as a sacred institution under threat from external ideological enemies. Moreover, churches and civic organizations began hosting rallies and public events that underscored the idea of American as a chosen nation. The Cold War era amplified a dangerous narrative that to be a good American, one had to be a faithful Christian. And any deviation from this was not just politically suspect, but morally bankrupt. The 1960s are remembered for revolutionary social change. The civil rights movement, counterculture protests, and a sweeping challenge to traditional authority. For many traditionalists, these shifts were signs of a moral decay that threatened the nation's divine mission. Amid this turmoil, the United States witnessed landmark legal cases that further eroded the strict separation of church and state. In 1962, the Supreme Court decision in Engel versus Vital ruled that state-sponsored prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. For conservative Christians, this wasn't just a legal ruling, it was seen as an attack on the country's sacred identity. The decision fueled a moral panic, rallying those who believed that the government was abandoning its duty to uphold biblical principles. The language emerging from this period was strikingly dichotomous, portraying secular institutions as corrupt and the Christian way of life as the only true safeguard against societal decay. Extremist narratives began to paint any reform or progressive change as a betrayal of America's divinely ordained destiny, pushing some adherents to see themselves as the last bulwark against a tide of secular immorality. The social and legal upheavals of the 1960s set the stage for a seismic shift in the 1970s. As cultural norms evolved, driven by the sexual revolution and an expanding acceptance of diverse lifestyles, conservative Christians began to feel that traditional American values were under attack. Another watershed moment came in 1973 with the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. For many believers, this ruling wasn't just a legal change, it was seen as a direct assault on the sanctity of life and a challenge to biblical principles. This catalyzed a robust political response. Think tanks like the Heritage Foundation quickly mobilized by framing abortion as the ultimate moral evil, arguing that it would lead to the disintegration of society's moral fabric. Along with emerging organizations such as the Moral Majority and the early formations of what would become the Christian Coalition, they began to argue that the nation's destiny was inextricably linked to its Judeo-Christian heritage. These groups organized grassroots networks, holding rallies, public forums, and distributing politically charged literature that warned of a looming moral apocalypse if liberal policies continued unchecked. They tapped into a deep well of grassroots funding from church congregations, small individual donations, and wealthy benefactors who were eager to see traditional values enshrined in law. By the late 1970s and into the early 80s, these networks were raising millions of dollars. This money was not only used for public relations campaigns and media outreach, but also to support political candidates who openly championed pro-life policies and other conservative Christian values. While then California Governor Ronald Reagan became the most prominent figure to champion this fusion of faith and politics, he was not alone. Political figures like Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina also embraced overt Christian messaging. Helms routinely wove scriptural references and moral imperatives into his speeches, portraying every political contest as a battle for the very soul of America. In addition, figures such as Pat Buchanan, who later would build on these themes, also used explicitly Christian rhetoric to galvanize support among conservative voters. From the pulpit, preachers played a critical role in this transformation. They told their congregants that every vote was a spiritual decision, one that would determine whether America would continue on its divinely ordained path or descend into moral chaos. Sermons painted liberal policies, especially those permitting abortion, as not only politically dangerous, but as a sin that risked the nation's eternal destiny. Believers were urged to donate generously, mobilize at the polls, and support candidates who promised to restore America's Christian foundations. The message was clear and uncompromising. Politics was no longer a neutral civic matter. It was a holy crusade, a battleground in which the forces of God were waging war against the forces of moral decay. In this charged atmosphere, the coordinated efforts of think tanks, political action committees, and pulpit preachers transformed political engagement into an all-encompassing crusade. The funds raised enabled the rise of candidates who were not just politically conservative, but also unapologetically driven by an agenda rooted in Christian ethics and the belief that America's future depended on a return to biblical values. The 1980s are often remembered as the decade of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, a period when charismatic leadership, optimistic visions of America as a shining city on a hill, and a melding of faith with politics created a powerful cultural force. Reagan's rhetoric, rich with biblical imagery and destiny, resonated deeply with many conservative Christians who saw in his speeches a reaffirmation of their belief in a divinely ordained national mission. However, the 1980s were also a time of transformative change in the media landscape, a change that would play a significant role in reinforcing the idea among many Christians that they were being persecuted by a secular, morally bankrupt society. One of the pivotal moments in this shift was the cancellation of the Fairness Doctrine in the late 1980s. Previously, this policy had required broadcasters to present balanced perspectives on controversial issues. Its repeal opened the floodgates for ideologically driven commentary, allowing hosts to broadcast their views without the obligation to offer counterpoints. Radio programs like Rush Limbaugh's and television shows such as The 700 Club took full advantage of this new environment. They crafted narratives that often portrayed the secular world as not only indifferent to, but actively hostile against Christian values. These platforms reinforced the us versus them mentality, painting a picture of Christians as an embattled minority under siege by liberal elites and the mainstream media. For many listeners and viewers, these messages weren't just entertainment, they were a call to arms. The repeated portrayal of political and cultural events as existential threats to their way of life helped to deepen feelings of isolation. This isolation was both psychological and moral. Psychologically, constant exposure to narratives of persecution fostered distrust of secular institutions and a belief that every policy decision was a direct assault on their faith. Morally, it bolstered an uncompromising stance that any deviation from biblical values was not only wrong, but tantamount to betraying a sacred mission. In effect, this period saw the creation of echo chambers, where dissenting voices were not just marginalized, but actively demonized. As these media voices grew louder and more pervasive, many Christian communities became increasingly insular, retreating further from engaging with the broader secular society. The result was a hardened, almost tribal mentality, where political engagement was seen as a holy crusade, and every vote, every donation, every political rally became a battle for the soul of the nation. The entire satanic panic and backlash against cultural changes in diversity, inclusion, and tolerance was a direct result of this isolated Christian thinking. This transformation had long-lasting effects on the Christian psyche. It reshaped how believers understood their place in society, no longer as one group among many, but as guardians of a divine mandate, perpetually at odds with a world that had forsaken God's truth. The psychological toll was profound, reinforcing a worldview defined by perpetual conflict, moral clarity, and the belief that their faith justified any action taken in its defense. As we move into the 1990s, the media landscape was rapidly evolving. While traditional outlets like talk radio and cable television had already deepened cultural divides, the advent of the internet and early forms of social media added a new digital dimension to the growing us versus them mentality among conservative Christians. In the late 1990s, online communities, through forums, chat rooms, and news groups, began to emerge as virtual meeting places. These early digital platforms quickly evolved into echo chambers where like-minded individuals could share ideas and reinforce their beliefs without facing any dissent. For many conservative Christians, these online spaces became sanctuaries where their worldview was not only validated, but amplified. This digital isolation also helped fuel the spread of conspiracy theories. Religious extremism, combined with the unfiltered nature of early social media, contributed to the growth of narratives like 9/11 truth and various anti-government conspiracies. In these echo chambers, every political or social upheaval was reinterpreted as evidence of a vast hidden agenda, a sinister plot designed to undermine Christian values and the nation's sacred destiny. Such theories were shared widely online, bolstering the belief that the government and mainstream media were complicit in betraying the country's divine mission. At the same time, the 1990s saw significant economic changes that further accentuated the divide between Christian conservative communities and their secular counterparts. Globalization, the rapid advancement of technology, and shifting industrial landscapes led to growing economic disparities. Many working class Americans, who often identified strongly with traditional Christian values, began to feel left behind by the fast changing economy. And true enough, they were being left behind. It was incredibly easy for grossly irresponsible politicians, especially in America's southern states, to lay the blame for these economic woes on immigrants, who have historically always been the easiest scapegoats. Legislators of both political parties were happy to blame immigrants for the catastrophic effects their policies and laws helped create. The 80s and 90s saw the rise of a greed is good attitude, which pervaded every aspect of corporate life. Lobbyists and political action committees sidestepped every regulation and law meant to stop them and gave corporations breaks over and over again on economic, environmental, and safety regulations designed to protect their workers and society from corporate predation. As a result, the wage gap between the C-suite executives and everyone else grew higher and higher, meaning more and more workers were being paid less and less, while the costs of goods and services rose quarter after quarter. Only profit mattered in this expansionist business environment. This economic disenfranchisement added fuel to the fire of cultural and political alienation. When combined with the digital echo chambers and extremist messaging, it reinforced a sense that not only were Christians being culturally marginalized, but they were also economically and politically abandoned by a system that no longer represented their interests. In essence, the 1990s became a period where traditional media and emerging online platforms converged to create tightly knit ideological enclaves. Within these digital and physical spaces, conservative Christians increasingly viewed themselves as the last defenders of a beleaguered, divinely ordained nation. The economic hardship of the time further shaped this divide, deepening the conviction that only a return to traditional values could restore a sense of security and purpose in an increasingly alien world. The events of September 11th, 2001, marked a turning point in American political and cultural life. In the aftermath of national tragedy, leaders like President George W. Bush tapped into a renewed sense of patriotism that was deeply intertwined with religious identity. The Bush administration's faith based initiatives further reinforced the idea that America's strength and moral direction were inseparable from its Judeo Christian roots. The following decades have seen an intensification of political polarization. The issues of abortion, same sex marriage, transgender rights, and public health have all become battlegrounds where extremist religious rhetoric is used to justify positions that often run counter to broader societal norms. More recently, events such as the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol have highlighted how extremist thinking, rooted in an uncompromising belief in a divinely sanctioned national destiny, can push groups toward illegal or even violent actions. In today's landscape, the digital echo chamber has only amplified these messages. Social media platforms have enabled the rapid spread of propaganda that blends faith with political identity, often using techniques common to cult recruitment. Isolation from dissenting voices, repetition of dogmatic slogans, and the construction of the all encompassing us versus them worldview. For many adherents, their actions, no matter how ethically questionable, are seen as a righteous defense of a sacred national mission. All of this has been crucial to how we landed where we are today, with not only democracy on the chopping block, but the entire concept of truth itself. In the post truth environment of our current age, there is no ability to differentiate right from wrong because the very concepts of right and wrong are up for grabs. Christian nationalists, like every other cult that has ever existed, believe their dogmatic, abusive practices are the answer to the chaos and uncertainty of everyday life. But due to the unique manipulations and changes in American Christian communities over the last many decades, their Christianity is no longer something isolated to Sunday services or even only to religious worship. There's a totalist flavor to U.S. Christianity now, where it pervades every aspect of their lives and thinking across social, educational, legal, and political domains. In other words, Christian nationalists and evangelicals across the U.S. have become convinced that the only way America can be salvaged and the only path forward for all Americans is to instill Christian values at every level of society. The concept at play here is one where extremist ideology sees the current order as so deeply corrupt that it must be completely dismantled, even violently, to pave the way for a new, divinely sanctioned society. Robert J. Lifton's book, Destroying the World to Save It, examines how Aum Shinrikyo embraced this kind of thinking. They believed that by destroying the old corrupt world, they could usher in a purified, transcendent era. In the United States today, a segment of Christian nationalists has adopted a similar mindset. They view modern government structures, its institutions, laws, and practices as fundamentally at odds with what they consider to be God's plan for America. To these adherents, the secular state is not just flawed, but is a direct enemy of a divinely ordained order. The belief is that rather than reforming a broken system from within, true salvation requires a complete and radical upheaval of current institutions. This destroy to rebuild mentality follows right on the heels of the us versus them that has been fed to Christians for decades. It isolates these communities from the broader society, casting secular and liberal institutions as not merely misguided, but as actively hostile to their values. As a result, many Christian nationalists feel justified, sometimes even compelled, to support or at times engage in actions aimed at overturning the government. They see such actions not as acts of lawlessness, but as necessary steps in a holy war to reclaim America for God. In essence, the psychological and ideological framework here mirrors that of cult like extremism, a belief that the world must be torn down in order to rebuild it in a way that aligns perfectly with an uncompromising vision of righteousness. This radical view undermines democratic norms and fuels a cycle of isolation, mistrust, and potential violence, with the promise of creating a saved society that, in their view, is the true destiny of the nation. Indeed, it is this kind of thinking that has turned evangelicals from a disparate group of biblical literalists into a much more organized and dangerous group of well-organized political extremists. From the reactionary fundamentalism of the 1920s to the hyper-partisan, media-fueled landscape of today, we've traced here today how a series of historical events and cultural shifts have contributed to the rise of Christian nationalism in America. What we've seen is not just a political ideology, but a form of extremist thinking that shares many traits with cults: an unwavering belief in a sacred mission, a tendency to dehumanize those who disagree, and the justification of actions, immoral, illegal, or unethical, through the lens of divine righteousness. Understanding this trajectory is crucial. It reminds us that when any movement begins to claim exclusive moral authority over a nation's destiny, it can pave the way for dangerous, divisive actions. Whether through legal battles, political mobilization, or outright defiance of democratic norms, the cult-like dynamics of extremism continue to shape our public life. I hope that today's podcast has helped shed some light on why we're living in the chaotic times that we are and some of what created this. Blame for social unrest and economic disparity cannot and should not be laid solely at the feet of Christian nationalists. There's a lot more going on in the world than just cultic influences. Economic, social, and political instability is the order of the day around the world, even in places where Christianity has no foothold of any kind. But in the United States, this is a unique and grave problem. The concept of destroying the world to save it lies at the heart of what Christian nationalists and evangelicals believe. And this is ultimately a destructive ideology, not just a religious faith. This is how cults cross the line into violence and bloodshed. Hopefully, that doesn't have to be our future. I hope that by trying to help you understand these events and motivations, you can take better informed and more effective action to stop this cult before it crosses lines that cannot be uncrossed. Thank you for watching or listening today. If this podcast or channel has been helpful or useful to you, consider supporting it through Patreon, PayPal, or using the other links in the description section below. See you next week. Bye-bye.